Awesome. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Dr. Amanda Varian. I'm the manager of the Office of Research Trainees at the University Health Network. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague Yasmin Mohammadazeh from the University of Toronto, Faculty of Medicine. We're grateful to have you all join us for this next seminar as part of the From Postdoc to Research Faculty Crash Course, which is being hosted in collaboration with Baycrest, KMH, UHN, SICKIDS, Sinat Health, Toronto Metropolitan University of Faculty of Engineering and Architectural Science, Unity Health, Temerity Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and the University of Toronto Smith Futures. If you joined for the previous sessions, welcome back. If you weren't able to attend the other ones and this is your first one attending, please definitely check out our program website, which has all of the recordings and slides from previous sessions so you can catch up on everything you missed. We have lots of great sessions that are coming up in the next couple of months, so definitely check those out and register for the one that you're interested in. So before I hand it off to our colleagues and speakers at the University of Toronto, I just wanted to give a couple of small housekeeping notes. You'll note that we're already recording this session, so you'll have access to that on the program website after. I also want to mention that you can turn on the transcription services or modify how you see the captions. So those features can be found at the bottom, panel at the bottom. We also just want to give a friendly reminder that we have pre and post surveys for each of the sessions. So if you haven't completed your baseline survey yet for this series, please look for your email. That should have come out. There will also be a survey after every session. These are just to help us to understand how effective the sessions are and how effective the program is so that we can improve it in future years. So thank you so much in advance for your time in completing those and helping us to evaluate the program. I also just want to mention that questions are strongly encouraged, so please add your questions to the chat at any time, and the speakers will be happy to address those questions. So with that, I will pass it along to our amazing speakers from the University of Toronto Centre for Teaching Support and Innovation. We're very lucky to have Christina D'Amico and Samantha Chan joining us here today. So I'll pass it off to them. Thank you, Christina and Samantha.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for our session today. I'm very happy to be here with my colleague Sam to talk a little bit about developing your teaching dossier. Sam, do you want to introduce yourself? I'm an educational developer at the Center for Teaching Support and Innovation. Sam,
I am also an
same.
educational developer in the same office.
Yes, so we're very much looking forward to sharing some of this information with folks today. We're going to start off our session with a land acknowledgement. We start all of our programming at CTSI with a land acknowledgement. This is the University of Toronto's official one, and I'll read it for us. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I thought usually we like to share resources related to the land acknowledgement, usually related to elements of teaching and learning or work at our institution. But in honor of the Olympics and the 3-3 hockey score happening right now between Team Canada and Czechoslovakia, I'm just going to share some Canadian Indigenous, some Indigenous Olympians that are notable, most notably Bridget Laquette, who's a Métis hockey player, if folks are interested. Just some interesting historical context, unrelated to teaching, but relevant to the moment, I feel. All right, we'll do a quick access check before we get started. Access will be a shared responsibility between all of us in the space today. We want to make sure the session is accessible and we want to be supportive for everyone. So just a couple of notes, the slides and the worksheets will be available. Sam has just dropped those in the chat for us. So thank you so much, Sam. You did drop those. Yes, you did. That was you. So we've got those materials there. If you folks want to make sure you can access those, if you'd let us know if you can't, that would be definitely an access issue. Feel free to take breaks whenever you need. We do have a 10-minute scheduled break at approximately the hour mark, but if you have to get up, live your life, do what you got to do. And welcome to participate in any way. Amanda mentioned questions are welcome, so you can raise your hand, you can put your question in the chat. We'd love to hear from you as the session goes on. And this is an open invitation, so if anything comes up with issues with volume, with the delivery, just let one of the facilitators know and we'll respond as we need to. All right, Let's check in today. How are we feeling? Let's take as our wonderful colleague, Jasjeet, at the Center for Teaching at Scarborough tells us, let's take a moment to arrive. Let us see how we are arriving today. So just let us know in the chat how you are feeling today. Are you one, focused and attentive, two, tired and reflective, three, energized and ready, four, stretched and competitive, and five, questioning and curious. I should add six, panicked about this tied game score on the Olympics. Deeply panicked of this Olympic upset. Thank you, Ariadne. I think that was your name. Lots of tired and reflective. Reflective is good, folks. You will find reflective practice is absolutely key to this process for putting a dossier together. Couple of threes, couple of fours. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for participating. Thanks for letting us know how you are. And maybe hopefully, maybe by the end, you feel one way now, and maybe by the end, you're going to feel really pumped and excited to start working on your teaching materials. So we'll see. What is our plan for today? So hopefully by the end of the session today, you'll be able to sort of clarify what your core teaching values are. And that's very important and a really necessary first step for putting together a strong dossier. Identify examples of your teaching practices and their impact on teaching. Drafted or refined key elements of your statement of teaching philosophy wherever you are in the process with that you should be able to either get a jump on it or do a little bit of work refining it. Identify evidence to support your teaching claims and develop concrete next steps for continuing your dossier. So some folks, maybe you're on the academic job market, maybe you're looking ahead to an academic specific job or the job season, but hopefully this will help you get something concrete in the books. So that's our plan for today. Any questions? Sam has once again shared our materials if you'd like the slides for reference, and we are going to be using a worksheet as we go through the workshop today. So we'll invite you to download your own copy of that, right, Sam, and work offline with that. Thank you. Oh, all right, great. So let's get rolling. So first sort of framing for folks is thinking about what is a teaching dossier. Maybe you've seen them from your colleagues or you've started working on one, but generally we want to stress two key components, that a dossier is a reflective document, and that's very important in terms of the style that it's written in and the kinds of pre-work you need to do to actually present a meaningful dossier. And it's an evidence-informed document. And that's also extremely important in terms of what you're actually including in the dossier, how you're making claims, and how you're supporting them. So the teaching dossier is a document in which you will make plenty of claims about your teaching practice, and we want to support those claims with evidence. So reflective and evidence-informed. The dossier will articulate your teaching values and goals, which we're going to start doing a little bit today. It describes your teaching practices, what you're doing in the classroom. Importantly, it demonstrates what your impact is on student learning, and then it shows your growth and future development. And depending on where you are in your teaching career, that growth and development could be very open-ended and broad, or, depending on the type of teaching you've done, it could be narrow, but some indication that your identity as a teacher and an instructor is growing and something you're often thinking about. So that's our kind of framing for what the dossier is. So generally, a strong dossier is, you could think about it, it's a narrative-based document. Sam's going to talk in our second half about the statement of teaching philosophy and how that will inform the dossier as a whole. But the whole thing is a narrative document. It's a giant document. I mean, the range is large for how many pages it might be. But in any case, even the shorter ones are quite substantial in page number. And ideally, you want the dossier to be telling a coherent story about who you are as an educator. So generally, what we look for, or what we try to get folks to do when they come and meet with us for a dossier consultation or in our workshops, is producing alignment across all of the components of the dossier. So we have here again those four key components re-articulated. What are the values for your teaching? Like what actually matters to you as a teacher? What are you actually doing to support these values? What impact are they having? And then how is that evolving? For an example, you might think about something like, it's really important to me to generate a lot of active learning in my classroom. I want students to be really engaged and involved in the teaching practice. That's great. So what do you do to actually make that happen? Can you give us something specific? How do you know that's actually helping your students learn? Do you have any evidence of that? And then how are you going to evolve that in your teaching practice? So you can think about that generating for every value, you've got to have some kind of sense of a practice, an impact, and a growth. I feel like if you remember nothing else from today, you must remember that you, for the every value statement, you've got to have the paired practices and impact. I know for Sam and I, when reviewing dossiers, sometimes they're heavy on the values, light on the evidence. Not because the evidence is not there, just because the genre of writing kind of people tend to write in vagaries, but we need details, we need specifics. And again, remember, it's an evidence-informed document, so that's how you want to be thinking about the construction. So we're going to get started with part one. Let's think about values. Let's think about what's actually important to you as an educator. And I really feel like this is where you have to start because you also have to get a sense of who you are, how do you understand yourself as an instructor before you start grabbing evidence or impact. This is the key place to begin. So we're going to do a quick activity that's more specific. So thinking about a time when you felt most proud of your teaching. A couple of subsequent questions you could think about, why were you proud? Did you share this with others? Who were those folks? And then what factors kind of contributed to that kind of teaching moment or teaching reflection? It can be a specific moment or something general. It's really up to you. There's space on the worksheet to do this writing. So, right, Sam? Correct. So if you want to take 3 minutes, I got my timer up here. To just write this down for us. Just take this. This is a personal reflection. So just take a few minutes to get that thinking started. All right. About the 3 minutes on my end. If folks are still writing, feel free to continue taking your notes down. But hopefully you were able to think, if not answer all the questions, you were able to think of some moment, something that you can kind of start, a place to start from as well. Our next piece is we're going to do a more kind of sustained values activity, kind of drawing from that initial reflection of something you were proud of, a teaching moment that you felt was very meaningful, and maybe where you felt actually in alignment with what is important to you and what actually happened in the classroom. So we've laid out here a variety just to kind of get people started thinking about teaching values that you might ways of concretizing teaching values, like if the nouns are not coming to you. We have several here you can possibly choose from. I'm just going to pop to the next slide. Sam, this is in the worksheet as well, right? This image here. So yeah, so if you have the list there, you can kind of refer back to it as we kind of go through the next activity. So we'd like you to select, like kind of go on our list here. And if the word, you can also use your own terms. If you feel like you have a strong sense of what your key value is, it's not here, you can use your own. But if not, you could use our list to select ones. Just select 3 key values from the list. Take a few moments to go through that. What does the value mean in your teaching? How does it show up in your classroom or mentoring? And why is it important to you? To see if you can answer these questions on 3 key values in your teaching practice. We're again going to give folks 3 minutes to do this. I recognize 3 minutes is hard to do this activity in because if you get through all of them on one, if you identify 3 and you answer all 3 for one, I think that's a good start because it'll give you a sense of how to speak to or respond to that core value. So I'm gonna reset my timer again for folks to have 3 minutes to kind of select a core teaching value and then think about these possible responses. And I'll note again for the couple of folks who've just joined in that Sam has dropped the worksheet in the chat. Oh my word! Thank you, Andy. Oh my gosh, I am over the moon. That is completely unrelated to the workshop today, but oh man, useless in the NHL, wonderful in the Olympics. But thank you so much, Ariadne, for this key important update for my core hockey values. I will let everyone continue with the exercise. Thank you so much. All right, folks, we got again 3 minutes on the end of my timer there. So I hope everyone had an opportunity to at least respond, identify three values, and maybe get through responding to these three questions in that process as well. So if you are comfortable and you would like to share, we would love to hear from you, but this is completely optional. And you can share, as much or as little as you like, but you could maybe put in one of the values you identified. That would be interesting to hear. And maybe about a brief summary of how you think it's actually showing up in your teaching practice. That would be really great. So we could love to hear from you. We'll just give people a few minutes to maybe type some responses in the chat. Shafi says collaboration as a key value. Awesome. Thank you. Christina says integrity and consistency, making a difference, critical thinking, and then empathy, inspiration, open-mindedness. That's great. Yeah, that's lovely. And that's all of those. I feel like there's a strong connection across all of those very student-centered driven values. Kimber says, oh, now they're all coming in hot and they're moving. One of mine was flexibility in my teaching to try to offer flexibility with deadlines, approaches to assignments, even in exam questions. I feel like it's important for accessibility. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and building accessible teaching practices. Even up from that, you could think, equity in teaching and learning as a core value that's driving those decisions. Katie says empathy, remembering that students are human first, responding with kindness and communication, flexible course design when life happens. Awesome. Carolina says encouragement, flexibility, interdisciplinarity. It's hearing a lot about flexibility, folks. We love to hear it. We love to hear people thinking about flexibility, thinking before the accommodation arrives or the being responsive or reactive to accommodation, thinking in advance about how to bring that into teaching. That's great. Ariadne says, oh, as many tools as possible with my students to empower them, teaching people to fish. Yeah, giving them the tools they need to environment that makes everyone comfortable and enables the most innovation. Yeah, that's great. Mayanka, I hope I pronounced that correctly, says equity, flexibility, and empathy. Wow, folks, yeah, really interesting. A lot of similarities across the board. Um, I'm also really interested that empathy kind of came up so heavily across these, which is great. And yeah, I will say since it just came up across that's definitely a pattern I'm noticing here. But even thinking about that as a value and then how you think of yourself as an educator, it's a very student-centered approach, right? My students are people. I want to respond to them as such. Their learning experience is important to me. How they experience me is important to me. And seeing that is actually connected to their success in teaching and learning. I think that's a great one, a way to maybe flesh that out and think about that more. Alexandra says, my teaching is built on critical thinking and curiosity. I'm trying to teach that no one knows everything. I believe information is always changing, so I want my students to know how and where to get that information rather than expecting that someone will always provide it to them. Yeah, that's great. I love that as well. Not everyone knows everything. Students are very, the desire to perform mastery, I feel, is very strong, but the people, no one wants to go through the miserable process of learning before they become a master, but that's actually how learning works. And I feel like that's getting effaced a lot. People forgetting that the process of learning is messy. So reminding them of that. Oh, these are awesome, folks. Thank you so much. That's great. So everyone's making a hot start on their values. So that's very important. Thank you so much for participating. All right, so the next piece we want to think about, we stressed at the opening, a strong dossier needs to demonstrate alignment. We can have very, very strong values. And again, lots of times these documents are heavy on the values because people know what's important to them, but then light on everything else. So we want to be heavy across the board. We want a heavy hit on all areas. So moving from values to coherence in the dossier. Values are shaping your decisions. Practices are in the classroom is what's helping to express your values, and then your impact is demonstrating what that's actually achieving. So ideally, again, I feel like this formula, again, if nothing else, what you're going to remember today is the Olympic hockey score. But if, if you don't remember anything else aside from that, this formula is so crucial. Values, practices, evidence. Every time you say you have a value, you got to have some practices paired with it, and you need to have some kind of sense of what the impact is. If you're missing one of those pieces, you're kind of working against that alignment. You're leaving your reader thinking, how do I know that this works? How are they actually doing this? Why are they actually doing this? You don't want them to have those kinds of questions. You want to be answering those questions for them. So again, a strong dossier is going to have alignment across all three of these categories. We've talked already, been saying the teaching practices, what are your practices quite a bit. So just to clarify what we mean by that. So they're basically the decisions you're making when you're putting together your course or doing your teaching, but that can be a lot of things. That can be how you structure a learning experience, how you are engaging learners in the classroom, the types of activities you use, the kinds of work you ask students to do, how you're assessing understanding, how you're building assignments, how you're providing feedback, your approach to mentorship or support in the classroom context, but maybe outside of it as well, maybe in your office hours. Basically, you can think of it as, what decisions are you making about what's actually taking place in the classroom? And teaching can occur in a lot of different contexts. It can be the lab space, but we also know, folks, here, your teaching could look very different. It could be in a clinic, a seminar, a this broad kind of category of teaching practice. So if you feel like, I've taught only one conventional class, but, you've run 20 labs and 15, dropped in on 15 seminars and done all of these other things, all of that counts. All of those decisions are important. Again, the key thing is aligning them to who you are as an instructor and then what the impact of that is. Sorry, I just seen one new comment in here. Oh, it was Mohammed responding to the last prompt. Thank you for that, Mohammed. Again, so the practices we've written on the slide here, but they're not just tasks, right? They're not just the grunt work of teaching. They're grounded in what your values are and what's important to you as an instructor, right? They're connected to your sense of what do I need to do to enable student success, to train the next generation of whatever I'm training. Like what does good teaching actually look like in my disciplinary context? How do I define that, right? That's informing all of your choices. So the practices component is very significant. So again, we're going to ask you to kind of start doing a little bit of this work. A lot of people, some of y'all had all the values. You had 3 values or more, which is amazing. So for each of the ones you've identified for your top values, now we want you to think about some practices. Empathy was the one that was in my mind here. So I'll use that just as an example now. So folks are saying, empathy is really important to me as a teaching value. So what are those practices that you're using to reflect that value? How do you do this intentionally because this is important to you? So what's your maybe planning process? And then where does this value show up? In what kinds of teaching, what context for your specific teaching? So that depends actually where you actually are doing your teaching. Once again, I'm going to hit my 3-minute timer and I'll let folks start doing this writing. And again, I see a couple of people have also joined us a bit later. So Sam has put the worksheets in the chat so you can use the worksheet to respond to these questions as we're kind of going to go through the workshop today. All right, folks. I got, again, 3 minutes is up here. Sam, we don't have it on the slide, but I'm okay for time. So I'm just going to see if people want to share maybe one or two practices. I would just love to hear a couple things that folks are doing. So I just give people a minute. If you would like to share maybe one practice, just like value plus the practice, I'd love to hear what folks are kind of doing to, bring their values into action, to bring them into the classroom. Um, Everyone had it at the ready. That's great. Carolina says flexibility, right? Providing solutions when student needs accommodations. Make some changes during the courses when students don't have the resources to conduct their assignments. Yeah, so thinking about making the course responsive to student needs and to where meeting students where they're at in a way, right? It's great. Christina says empathy, understand each student's situation, meet the students and talk about their projects individually, checking in with them each week, seeing how they're doing, relative flexibility in deadlines in case of crises. Yeah, that's great. Checking in, keeping those lines of communication open as well, because again, sometimes students might be hesitant to be forthcoming about things, but then the more the communication is open, you're just like giving them an opening every time to be like, actually, I need some support. Actually, it's not really working for me right now. But so yeah, that's a great one. Alexandra says, value critical thinking. So to support critical thinking, I like to give existing data sets and ask, what can they do with it? What kinds of scientific questions can they ask with it? Usually on the next class, we go to the real publication and discuss how the authors use the data set to find pros and cons in their methodology. After thinking about the data themselves, students more readily understand the methodology in the paper. So it's a good practice on how to work with existing literature. Yeah, that's great. And that really gives students the benefit of the doubt too, that you feel confident enough to say like, I'm going to reverse do this for them and then see what they can come up with. I think, yeah, if they can do that well, that would also build a lot of student confidence and really necessary for critical thinking. They need to be confident in their practice and in their skills, their intellectual skills. Kimber says community, facilitating and encouraging students to work together, working through problems together as a team, creating non-hierarchical classroom where I'm a fellow learner informed by my students' ideas and experiences. Yeah, that's great. And that's very challenging to do in some teaching contexts where there is the presumption of hierarchy already. So you're kind of working against the student's own bias that there will be that hierarchy and like kind of bringing everybody on board for that. And that's great. Mohammed says, value empathy. I reassure learners during difficult protocols. Bead mill homogenization troubleshooting. I don't know what that is, but I agree it sounds very difficult to troubleshoot and help them adjust expectations. Next, I plan to implement reflective learning, improve self-awareness, and strengthen emotional resilience in research. What a phrase, eh? Yeah, that's a great one. And that's actually honestly probably something that's not, well, I shouldn't say not talked about enough, but I think could be talked about more because research is so challenging, experimentation. Again, the question of going back to one of our previous commenters, I think it was Christina, I can't remember, but mentioning that students going through the difficulty of achieving mastery. Like there's so much struggle built into the learning process. And then also you could extend that to the research process. So how do you build that? Yeah, not just the practical skills, but the emotional resilience. So you keep trying to get the results you actually want. That's a great one. Thank you. Great. I'm so glad I asked people to share for timing's sake, but that's fantastic. Thank you, everyone. All right, so we've got values, we've got practices. Now we must do the all-important evidence-based thing, and we must connect this to impact. Impact is very important. So our next task, we're going to also have 3 minutes to do this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about impact before we go on. So for each practice you've articulated, the thing you're doing in your classroom. So what impact is this practice intended to have? So you're doing X, what's your intention? What do you want to happen, right? That's important. What kinds of learner growth might it support? What do you think it's aimed to do? And I would also say, do you have evidence that it works? Do you have any evidence that what you're doing is the intended impact actually happening? And how do you know? How are you as an instructor assessing your own impact and assessing your own practices? So there can be lots of ways to do this. Impact is a big category and it can contain a lot of things. We've listed some here. So it could be growth in areas like student confidence, analytical skills, critical thinking skills, student independence, engagement, their sense of belonging, competence, communication. There can be lots of places where you can identify this. It doesn't just have to be in assessments, for example, as in, I did X activity, students did well in the exam. That's not a bad example, but that doesn't have to be the only one. There can be lots of different types of evidence. I would also suggest as well thinking about sources of evidence and the types of evidence you're using to think about impact. A lot of times people can use, they may use course evaluations or direct student feedback, whether it's anonymized or from an email. Those might be the first things we go to, and those are great examples. That's a great type of evidence as well, to use. But there can also be observational evidence, things you as an instructor notice to say, I had a very quiet group and nobody spoke to one another. But by the end, we were all working in unison. That is also evidence of practice. And you as the instructor, you're also a voice of what do you call it? Legitimacy in the document. Like your observational evidence counts, right? That's part of it. The key here is when you're putting your dossier together and you're thinking about it, you just want a diverse range of types of evidence, as many as you can. I'm imagining folks here, maybe you're in the earlier stages of this process. So you might just be in the stage where you're starting to collect evidence to kind of demonstrate impact. And that's fine as well. So just as a recommendation, it might be to think about what types of evidence do I have? What impact is it showing? Maybe what do I need? What do I need to start asking for going forward? So I will let folks, again, we're going to have 3 minutes for people to write and reflect on this. Again, you can use the worksheet. And yes, you can think about where you note impact and then maybe where you might want more evidence of that. I'm going to pop in the chat here. Stephanie says, I think you said, I haven't taught actual classes besides guest lectures. I've done a lot of mentoring and supervising. Give some examples of impact for this case. I mean, there's tons. I mean, it would be a question of first, what's your approach to mentoring? What do you do to be a strong mentor? And how is that actually helping your students? Like, what's the outcome for student success in those mentoring relationships? So I would look back to that to say, how is my mentorship approach actually supporting my students? That would be one thing. Guest lecturing as well. That's basically creating a lecture with course outcomes. You have a whole plan. Like, did you do learning activities in the class? Did you check for understanding? Were students responsive to that? What was the context of the lecture? How did it fit into the broader course? I would say you'd have to think about if you have these, they're not non-traditional, but if you have these teaching experiences that are outside of, I'm not just teaching my own course, you really want to think about what was the actual activity? What was my goal? What was my plan? What am I trying to do here? And did it happen in some way? Did I see it actually materialize in some fashion, right? And obviously as well talking about how your choices for your guest lectures or your mentoring is informed by what's important to you as an instructor, informed by your understanding of the discipline and what's important for the discipline as well. So that's where I would start, Stephanie, but that's a great question. I feel like a lot of people are in your position where they have a bunch of all of these really diverse types of teaching experiences, and they're trying to bring them together in that coherent narrative. Like that's basically the work of this process. That's a great question. Sam put in a great recommendations as well that I'll read for all of us because that's very important. Some sources of evidence could be emails, conversations with mentees and supervisees, student conference presentations, and publications. Yeah, those are great, concrete things to draw on. Fantastic. I'll give folks another few minutes before I'll read Mohammed's impact as well, and then we'll move us to the next. But I'll give folks a few more minutes to write and think about what that might be. I'll reset my timer. All right. I hope folks had an opportunity to do a little bit of writing or even start thinking in this direction. I'm going to read what's in the chat here because I feel I have the time before I get to the end of this section here. But Mohammed said, impact from my practice. I expect students to build trust and psychological safety, encourage them to cultivate empathy in their own clinical or research practice. Awesome. Sarah says, I want students to stay curious when they feel engaged in class. They continue thinking about the topic afterwards. They ask deeper questions. They seek more ways to get involved. Yeah, that'd be great for examples of how they're doing that. Over time, this builds their confidence, strengthens critical thinking, helps them become more independent learners who can connect with the field. Awesome. Alexandra says the values, critical thinking, the practice, give existing data sets and ask what can they do with it? Impact, independence and research competence. Now they know how to ask scientific questions and they're not afraid to test their own hypotheses. Awesome. That's great, folks. And you can see again, the key here is when you're thinking about your impact piece that you're having your specific details and you're identifying the type of evidence it is. Is it observational? Is it in what you're seeing in assignments? Is it what you're seeing in how students are responding? Is it what you're seeing in the classroom? Is it what students are telling you, right? Making sure that the impact piece, you're identifying like the type of impact and where that evidence is coming from. But these are awesome examples. All right. So just thinking again, because alignment is the sort of, I guess, the key kind of takeaway from this section that if to have a strong dossier, you need alignment across all of these pieces. So you can take a moment to reflect, I mean, either today on your own, but as you're doing this process. So where does alignment feel strong across this activity? Where you can clearly go, oh yeah, values, practices, impact. I have this locked down. If I had to just explain to somebody why I'm doing this and why it works, I can absolutely do that. And where do you feel like you might need more information? Where do you think that the link is not that is as strong, or maybe you need more evidence? Sometimes it's an interesting way that these could work. Sometimes you feel like I don't have enough evidence to identify this. Sometimes it might be that you think, you know what, is this actually the practice that's bringing this to life? Maybe am I doing something else? And sometimes it goes all the way the other way. It's like, is this actually the value? Or do I need to kind of recurate and readdress that? I mean, it's a process in doing this, but this kind of formula is necessary for the building the strong dossier. This is also going to save you time because when you're later putting together your dossier, you're deciding what are my teaching artifacts? What am I going to put in as my appendices? What's going to substantiate my narrative? You've already identified those sites and sources of impact. That's going to be informing what actually goes in the dossier. So you're not just shoving every possible syllabus, lecture slides or anything in there. You're being very careful about how you're curating your materials. And on the whole, that's telling that's telling a clearer narrative about who you are as an instructor. So this kind of exercise is really important. And as sort of Sam, in putting this together for us, this is kind of, I think, a crucial first step, like starting here and then going to collect everything and starting that process, I think is really helpful. So we'll just leave you again to think about those questions. And as you can kind of maybe, depending on where you are in your process, you could build that into your next steps as well to say, okay, where do I need to strengthen connections? And on which category do I need to start doing that work? And at this is a great stage to be doing that type of process. And you'll find over time too, you're going to be refining these. And as time goes on, you'll start collecting more practices. You'll be trying newer and different things, and you'll be also collecting more sources of evidence. So you have greater impact statements to share as well. The last thing I'll just say about impact, I feel like you're all data people, so you don't need to hear it from me, but numbers, all of that stuff, I'm not a data person. I'm not a science gal. But that was a helpful tip for me as well. And thinking of sometimes impact statements, they can be qualitative, but quantitative is also a very powerful tool. So just again, thinking about that category broadly will really help you put together a strong kind of diversified dossier. I think I did great for time here, Sam. I feel like I'm 2 minutes early. So we can take a 10-minute break. Should we come back do you want to come back right at 2 or 10 to? What do you think, Sam?
I think right on the hour is perfect for folks. So
Okay.
see everyone at 2.
Awesome. We'll see you at 2, everyone. I'm going to go watch that overtime goal and I will return to you and see everybody back in 10 minutes.
Welcome back, folks. I hope you had a good break. Let me know in the chat if you're back in the space. I'm happy to also hold for a few minutes, or a couple of thumbs up will be great as well. Thank you, Amanda. Welcome back, Chris. How was the overtime shot?
I ended up making coffee instead.
Oh, coffee is very important. That's okay.
I really want to savor it, so I feel like that it would be
Okay.
best to do it after so I can really freak out appropriately. But I have stopped sharing so you can reshare your own slides to move everyone
Beautiful.
through.
And actually, if you can let me know, am I sharing my slides right now? Yes.
Yep, I can see.
Okay, perfect. And hopefully folks are back in the chat as well. Um, I think folks are back. Let's move on, because really the first slide we have for the second half is this reiteration of the importance of alignment between values, practices, and impact. And as Chris noted multiple times now, if this is the only thing you take away from today's session on teaching dossiers, is that you need to align your values, practices, and impact. And one thing that many of us do at CTSI when we're doing dossier consultation is we will mark up the document, think about, oh, this is a values, I know this is a practice, I know this is an impact, but sometimes what we also notice is actually this is a great practice. I don't know if this actually supports this value. Like I don't see the connection. So a part of creating a teaching dossier and writing a statement teaching philosophy is really thinking about how are you articulating this alignment and helping your readers who are quite general. There's readers from different contexts coming to your document, helping them understand the linkage between values, practices, and impact. So for the remainder of today's session, we're actually going to get into the teaching dossier components, but you've actually sort of started your teaching dossier through the values, practice, impact activity. We were very tricky. We put that activity first. So it's not that we're saying you are drafting your teaching dossier right now. We're like, think about a moment of pride. And now think about your values, think about practices and impact. And voila, you've actually taken a huge step towards one of the most important documents in your teaching dossier, which is the Statement of Teaching Philosophy. Now, the Statement of Teaching Philosophy is often a document that can stand on its own, and it's a concise narrative that articulates your teaching values and describes how you're putting those values into action via your teaching practices and strategies, and then explaining the impact that you have on learners or that you aim to have on learners. And the remainder of the teaching dossier document then provides various artifacts and pieces that reinforces the impact as linked to your practice, as linked to your values. And then your statement of teaching philosophy often ends with the signal towards your ongoing development and your future goals as an educator. On the right-hand side of the slide, we've emphasized that the statement of teaching philosophy functions as a roadmap for your teaching dossier. So if your readers didn't read your entire document, they've only read your statement of teaching philosophy, they would have a very clear idea of who you are as an educator, what are your values, what have you done, and what are the implications and impacts of what you've done. To help you structure your statement of teaching philosophy, again, you're seeing the same words, the same colors come back, thinking about how do your values, what do you believe about teaching and learning, feed into what are you actually doing in the classroom, in the lab, in your mentorship relationships, and what are the impacts on the learner growth, their practices that you've observed, or what do you aim to support? And finally, ending with that growth piece. How is your teaching evolving? What are your future goals? What are you doing as you evolve your practices or as you want to adjust on the impact? So again, this structure aligns exactly what you've done in the worksheet, which was the table that started on page 3. And you've begun to fill out the 3 columns that highlights what do you care about? How are you enacting upon these things? And what are the impact and the reflection that you're in sharing as you're observing these various impact. So really now the final column, the growth column, allows you to think about what are some things that you still want to do as an educator. Maybe you have a great activity, but you're not getting the results you anticipated. The growth column is an opportunity for you to capture those reflections and to think about, well, what can I adjust? Who can I talk to? Are there any seminars that I may need to attend? Are there other theories that I want to visit or other conversations that I want to have with my peers, with past students? So really thinking about how are you building yourself as as an educator. So I want to give a quick pause here, again, to re-emphasize that you actually started your statement teaching philosophy today by articulating your values and beginning to identify your practice and impact. What questions are you curious about when it comes to this document, the statement teaching philosophy? Chris and I already anticipate particular questions, but we're curious if those are the questions you'll be asking in the chat. So give a moment of pause here. Maybe all of you are feeling so confident about your statement of teaching philosophy now that you spent the past hour talking about your values, practices, and impact. So, Christina, that was one of the questions we anticipated. How many values should we state in the statement? Generally, a statement teaching philosophy is around 1 to 2 pages, sometimes extending to 3. So given the length of the document, I do notice that usually around 3 values seem to occupy enough space. And thinking about also how you're going to be articulating the values later on in your teaching dossier, which is essentially a portfolio, 3 values seems to build a very strong foundation. Of course, Chris, if you've noticed other statement teaching philosophies that's engage with less or more values, please feel free to share.
I will say some of the really strong state, like it's one
Mm,
value, like something really impactful, like, equity in teaching, like something big, but then all of the practices are so diversified of how they're bringing this to life. And that's often quite a nice approach. So it really isn't
mhm.
like the more values, the better. I think the more specificity in the examples and the stronger the evidence, the
Yeah.
better, really.
And that makes a lot of sense, especially for some of the values like inclusion, equity, where they're so broad and there's so many different examples and contexts in which those things happen. And Christina, in the chat, I anticipate you're thinking about what the department's value are and thinking about whether or not there's alignment between the two. One of the things is when we're and thinking about job searches, job applications, when you're visiting institutional website, departmental website, it is useful to sort of search around on what are some of their priorities as an institution, but then always really centering your values as an educator, right? Because your statement teaching philosophy isn't necessarily going to change from institution to institution to institution. One would hope that, for example, with the value of inclusion, that's something that's really long-standing, that's very grounded, that shifts to many different contexts. I think what might be interesting is thinking about what are the contexts and examples that you're describing and how perhaps the institution that is hiring can see that intersection, can see that a practice that has existed elsewhere could be transferable to different contexts. I hope that was helpful. We did know one of the questions that often comes up is length. And if you go online, if you Google statement teaching philosophy, there are lots of different examples. Some could be 5 pages, some are 1 page. I think it's really important to note that at the end of the day, you want to have a very clear, well articulated, and coherent statement of teaching philosophy. So longer or shorter doesn't necessarily mean better. Mohammed has shared, should the values in our teaching philosophy come from our past experiences, or can they also be values we aim to develop in our future teaching practices? This is such an important question, and I would say Both. Both can be valid and both can be true, especially because, as we noted earlier with some of the examples shared in the chat, values do connect to one another and they do intersect. So having values that certainly ground your past experiences, but then also values that point to how you're developing as an educator. Maybe you're really interested in this whole idea of universal design for learning, and you've begun to engage with this conversation. One of your values of inclusion does still intersect with this type of future looking practice. Kate has shared, is it generally good or bad to include our personal experience as a learner, or should we focus on our role as a teacher? I mean, it's very hard to divorce ourselves from our past experiences. I do think past experiences direct a lot of our current actions. Again, though, bringing back to within the statement of teaching philosophy, how do you ensure that values, practices, and impact doesn't get lost? If telling a story about your past experiences really drives at the point of this is why this value is foundational to everything that I do, then I think that could be really, really helpful. However, writing a one page about a past experience, about how this is why you fell in love with teaching and learning, may not strengthen that alignment and linkage between values, practices, and impact. I'm also very curious, Chris, I know you've looked at lots of statement teaching philosophies. What are your thoughts about this one?
I think it's like if you're talking about values and that are very distinct to you, it makes a lot of sense that you might value something might be important to you as a learner, and therefore that's also important to you as an educator. Like that feels very intuitive to me as a connection. It also, I think, demonstrates that you, when you're thinking about, it's like a connection to the students, like you're remembering yourself in that as in that role, in that position. Someone else in our comments had also talked about being like, I am a learner in this space too. I'm also here with you, like depending if you have a more non-hierarchical approach to teaching and learning. So I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's really context specific, but as a general statement, you feel like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as a
Mm-hmm.
way of articulating values.
Yeah. Thank you. I really like your point about the context specific nuance there. And specificity is very important in statements of teaching philosophies and teaching dossiers. There are instances where some jobs were only asked for the statement of teaching philosophy without the entire dossier. And this is why we're dedicating more time to this conversation about statement of teaching philosophy. Mohammed has shared, is it a must to create a link between both or articulate well so it reflects on our teaching philosophy pathway? Are you talking about the link between, say, our personal story and our values? Sorry if I'm missing something there, and I'll give you a chance to type in the chat. I'm going to look at Kimber's question. At the moment, is it common to have citations in your teaching philosophy statement, e.g. referencing book or academic articles that have inspired or influenced your practice? So in the past, I have reviewed statements of teaching philosophies that do include references, and there are certain divisions that sort of looks for it, but keep in mind that this is a statement of teaching philosophy, not a literature review. So there is that fine balance of really centering what are your values, what do you do, and how do you know that your practices are effective? And then Mohammed looping back, link between past experience, lived or teaching, and the future teaching aspirations. I imagine there is some connections between them. I haven't seen examples where they're completely separate from one another. And so as you're drafting your statement teaching philosophy, I imagine there's going to be a nice pathway and segue into both so that they do talk to each other. All right. That was our statement teaching philosophy. Some of the other questions we anticipated had to do with drafting the statement teaching philosophies and strategies to really strengthen this document. So one of the simplest way to strengthen your statement teaching philosophy is to actually write in the first person. So we don't want to slip into abstract language because at the end of the day, this document is about you. So for example, having a statement like effective teaching fosters critical thinking. Well, yes, I agree with that, but try perhaps rephrasing to say, I design scaffolded case analysis to help students develop critical thinking skills. So here we're seeing that the value is critical thinking and it's being translated into a practice, which is the scaffolded case analysis and connected to impact. So this shift into the I statement really helps shift from general principles, general teaching and learning, pedagogical philosophy and theory into personal action that strengthens your clarity and credibility as an educator. Strategy number two has to do with clarifying your context. So this has come up a few times already in the first hour. So explaining what your context is very important for your readers because we don't want to assume that they understand what context you're working in, and also acknowledging you've probably worked in many different contexts. Also, we know that teaching just doesn't exist in a vacuum. What works for one class may not necessarily work for another. So earlier we had an example about active learning. So instead of just stating, I use active learning to engage students, maybe clarify like, well, what context do you work in? For example, in graduate level lab meetings, I use structured problem solving discussions to engage trainers and experimental design. So when you're saying it like this, now we understand who you are as an educator. Who are you teaching? At what level? What is the format? And just slipping in these little contextual details really helps your reader interpret your decisions accurately. So this is very important because your statement of teaching philosophy will likely be read by individuals not necessarily in the exact same department as you, working in the exact same context. So by providing a little bit of context, you're actually strengthening clarity, credibility, and that coherence piece. And finally, we're going to offer one more strategy for your statement and teaching philosophy, which is thinking about how are you writing for a broad academic audience, right? So even though we have individuals that also work in STEM, they may be outside of your specific research areas. They may not share your disciplinary vocabulary or methodological language. Now, I'm not saying you need to simplify your ideas, but I do think that it's important to aim for clarity. So, for example, instead of stating, I integrate epistemological reflexivity into my pedagogical praxis, which, by the way, is a statement that, as an art historian, comes up quite a bit, maybe rephrasing a little bit to, I encourage students to examine how knowledge is produced in our field and to question underlying assumptions, right? So just a little bit more clarity for a broad range of reader. So now your ideas are more accessible. It doesn't lose that intellectual depth. And in fact, it makes it more credible because it's so clear, it's easy to understand, and becomes more persuasive and more memorable in many cases. So those are our three strategies: writing using I statement, providing context, and thinking about your audience, which often are quite broad. And finally, when we're talking about your statement of teaching philosophy, when there is space and time to do so, do seek feedback. Considering asking a colleague or someone you trust, a mentor, to review your statement of teaching philosophy. You can even ask them very specific questions like, do you know what my values are? And I've often gotten emails from colleagues about this. Well, they'll send me a draft and they'll say, what did you perceive my core values to be in teaching and learning? And sometimes I'll articulate something and the person will be like, oh, actually, that wasn't it. But I can see where you got this based on the practices that I described and the impact and the artifacts that I reference. So really being intentional when you're seeking feedback, you're not asking whether or not your statement teaching philosophy is good or bad. You're actually really asking about that clarity piece. Is the alignment between values, practices, and impact clear? Are my examples concrete and specific? Do they convince you? And does the statement sound authentic and coherent? Does it sound like you, the educator? Or does it just sound like a generic statement that, teaching and learning is important as lifelong learners in this world, right? That's very vague. Who are you as an educator? So those are our pieces around statement of teaching philosophy. Again, you've started this already. So I feel like at CTSI TTP, we often do this where we get people to do an activity. Afterwards, we reveal like, you've actually done all of this. Good for you. So I hope you feel a little bit more confident today about how you might be revisiting a past statement of teaching philosophy draft, or if you're starting a new draft and thinking about, well, I've actually have a couple pieces I know where to jumpstart from. I'll do a quick pause here again, just because for the next part, we're actually going to dive into the other component of teaching dossiers. So statement teaching philosophy is the first document within a teaching dossier. But how are folks feeling? I wish I can show, should we go back to our animal slide video? Not video, slide with the 5 animals of like, how are you feeling with see all slides. I can do this. I can jump back to our puppies. So instead of how are you arriving today, how are you feeling about your statement of teaching philosophy right now at 2:20 p.m.? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We got energized and ready. We got questioning and curious. We got some stretch and contemplative, definitely. I'm imagining there's a few that are also in the reflective zone. So lots of 3, 4s, and 5s, some 2s, no 6s right now because the hockey game has concluded. Okay, I appreciate you sharing where you're at. So for the next part, let's dive into the main components of teaching dossiers with the recognition that sometimes different requirements will ask for different things in the dossier, but what we're sharing here are the components that often do appear within teaching dossiers. So hopefully I'm sharing the correct slide. Yes, I think I am. We've talked about the statement of teaching philosophies. We emphasized and reiterated the importance of alignment between values, practices, and impact. So now we're going to look at the 6 core components of a teaching dossier. So we've already gone through number 1, statement of teaching philosophy. This is your narrative anchor. This is the roadmap that signals what matters to you in your teaching, and in many ways signals what's to come for the rest of the dossier. Next, teaching experiences. So this section outlines your roles and responsibilities, courses you've taught, supervision, mentorship, relationships, workshops, other instructional contexts in which you've been teaching. And teaching takes on many forms. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Third, your teaching practices and strategies. So this is an area where you can really expand on how are you designing learning? How are you structuring engagement? How are you assessing learners and providing feedback? So in this part, again, you're still going to be linking it back to your values, right? You're going to be clarifying, like, I do these things because I care a lot about these values, right? So this section doesn't separate you from your teaching values, but it really gives you a chance to highlight those teaching practices. And then 4 is the evidence of teaching effectiveness. So this is impact. So when we talk about evidence of teaching effectiveness, this includes both formal and informal indicators of impact and learner growth. So earlier in the chat, we had examples of talking about student emails, conversations you have with students. Those are usually considered informal, but maybe you facilitated a workshop on teaching and learning and there was a survey. So that's slightly more formal. Or in context where you've taught a course, you might have course evaluation data that you can draw upon. So the evidence of teaching effectiveness is really drawing on multiple sources of data. And it's important here to emphasize multiple sources of data. You don't want to rely on one type of data alone. Having different forms of data will allow you to unveil different nuances with your teaching and learning. The 5th section of your teaching dossier is professional development. So this is a section where you get to show how are you developing as an educator over time, and maybe what additional things you're thinking of doing. And this could include, for example, this workshop that you're attending, different conferences, different panels you've attended. Now, it's important to highlight here, this isn't just a listing of workshops you've attended. That really does not connect well to your values. So again, when we're talking about professional development, in the back of your head, I hope you can still think about well, what are my values? Why do I want to learn more about, say, inclusion? Why do I want to learn more about different approaches to engage with students? Maybe because my value is critical thinking and I'm trying to just find different ways to reach my diverse groups of learners. And then finally, this is probably the longest section in your dossier. These are the appendices. So all the supporting documentation, all the artifacts that support and reinforce the claims that you've made elsewhere in your dossier. Maybe in your statement of teaching philosophy, you talked about how you received mid-course feedback from a class and the students noted how they were struggling to understand this lab procedure. And so what you did for the second half of the term is you created a little video walkthrough of how to engage with the process. And then maybe in parentheses, you actually say, this is shown in Appendix F. Right? So the appendices is a very strong tool for you to actually drop all of these artifacts throughout your teaching dossier. So we're gonna walk through each of these components in more detail. But first, I really want to emphasize that your teaching dossier, your portfolio, is a combination of narrative and artifacts. So it's not just a collection of documents, right? It's very intentionally constructed to connect narrative and artifacts. So your narrative explains your values, practices, and growth, and your artifacts are the materials that supports those claims. They're the evidence. They demonstrate your values, right? So the narrative help make the artifacts meaningful, while the artifacts makes the narrative credible. Do you see that connection there? And I mean, all of you are researchers. I feel like this is also foundational to any type of research, but it's even more so in a teaching dossier, helping your readers understand that connection. So a strong teaching dossier will intentionally connect these two parts. And instead of just simply presenting materials, they'll explain them. They'll show them how it demonstrates the values. So on slide 28, what we've done here is we've created a table to kind of give you an overview of how these things are connected, where they show up. A statement of teaching philosophy is very much a narrative format, right? But as you move through to other sections of your teaching dossier, you start realizing that you do need to integrate other things. So, for example, teaching experiences is often presented in a table format where you're listing courses, your roles, the dates, responsibilities, but you do still need a narrative context to start so that folks will know, like, what am I looking at? What do you want me to pay attention to on this table, right? And sometimes through these tables, you might note things like, for a couple of years, you were teaching online because, as we know, around 2020, the context changed and certain things happen. So that narrative accompanied by tables is critical to making your teaching experience really speak. For teaching practices and strategies, those are often much more narrative based because you're expanding on how you're designing learning, your assessment, how you're mentoring your students. Whereas as you move into the impact evidence of teaching effectiveness, this is again an opportunity for you to integrate narrative interpretation with tables, right? Maybe you have some quantitative data that is useful to share, but you do want to frame it. So you can remind your readers about the context, about what your values are, why you're focusing on certain numbers changing throughout time. And then for professional development, thinking about, again, it's not just a list of your workshops or certifications or training that you've attended, but really providing that narrative explanation of, like, why did you attend those things? What did you learn? And how did you apply them? Maybe you went to a workshop, you've tried something, but it didn't actually work out well. But that's still important to note because it shows your growth as an educator. And then finally, the appendices, your supporting documentation. So selected artifacts, please don't include everything you've ever created. So it's not beneficial to have 16 syllabi and 58 assignments. But you're being very selective on what are you including so that it backs up the practices that you've noted. It shows that impact and it reinforces your values. So you're going to have a little bit of that narrative introduction so you can remind your readers of your values. Maybe by the time they get to the appendices or they took a break while they're reading their teaching dossier, they come back to appendices, they're like, wait, what is this? Like, why should I care about this? So having a narrative introduction just reminds your readers like, hey, recall, these are my values. Here's what I did, and here's the evidence supporting it, or here's the materials that really supported my practice. I'm going to quickly look at the chat for a moment. So Kimber shared, a lot of the faculty jobs I have been interested in only giving you a couple of pages to work with your teaching philosophy and experience. How do you incorporate evidence, e.g. positive teaching evaluations, without having much room to append them? So most Dina also confirmed that most jobs indicate not to exceed 3 pages to include all of these components. So I have a follow-up questions. Are they saying your teaching dossier can only be 3 pages, or are they asking for a teaching philosophy that is maximum 3 pages? Teaching dossier, 3 pages. Whoa, Chris, I feel
I'm
like we
actually
need to
gonna
rethink the whole thing.
I'm going to put in the chat for folks an interesting article that came out November last year. It was put out by one of our colleagues actually at the Scarborough campus. Herself and another colleague at Western put together over kind of 2,000 academic jobs and looked at what they were asking for in terms of teaching experience. So interestingly, the statement of teaching philosophy is actually asked for most consistently as a
Yeah,
document. Usually the main thing that's asked for. And then that goes up with the type of role it is. So the more permanent the role, the more the statement is asked for. It's really interesting to see what's kind of being asked. I mean, again, you folks are all in a kind of disciplinary area, so this may be more or less representative just for interest. But I also
mhm.
think if you have 3 pages for everything, you need a statement. You need a summary, a way of summarizing your teaching data, like whatever your teaching data is going to be. And then maybe you want to append like one type of teaching artifact, or maybe you want to use 2 pages to write a statement and then have 1 page of kind of summarized teaching data. You can always say that very special phrase, additional materials available upon request, if that's, if you want to gesture towards that.
Yeah,
Um,
I
but I
agree
would
with you,
say
Chris. Yeah,
yeah, I think that doesn't seem to me to be the norm. This could be kind of a feature of maybe the roles that people are seeing in your disciplinary
yeah.
area. It might be helpful to chat with colleagues in this area to say, what are your materials looking like? Because on the whole, that's not really the norm in terms of what's being asked for, but it's
Yeah.
interesting to hear.
Yeah. Definitely check out the University Affairs article by our colleague Lisa Aikman, and I forgot the other person's
Jerry
name.
Turner's Jerry.
Jerry Turner.
Yeah.
Excellent article. Usually when job postings are asking for 3 pages, it's really a teaching philosophy. And this 3 pages gives you more space to really get into things. Now there's a couple of different ways that folks have worked around wanting to include artifacts along with it. They would hyperlink out to particular syllabi that they've posted online, things like that. But being mindful of double checking if that's agreeable, something you can do. For a full teaching dossier to be 3 pages, I wonder if there's a misconception of what a teaching dossier is. And like Chris noted, oftentimes that really is just your 2 page statement of teaching philosophy, a very short list of like courses taught, and a very brief overview of teaching eval data. Again, opportunities to link out. Now, there are various academics around the world who have openly shared their teaching dossiers online. At CTSI, we do not provide examples of teaching dossiers for one very important reason, is that context matters. It's so different from discipline to discipline to discipline. And it's very important that this dossier is a very personal portfolio. And so as a result, I think it's been at least 20 years that we've provided examples of dossiers. That doesn't stop any of us from Googling and checking out what's there. What's very helpful as a good practice, though, is to ask colleagues for even the table of contents of their teaching dossier, because often that is very revealing in itself, and thinking about how they're organizing their teaching information, and then also how many pages they've spent in particular sections. Sorry, I'm skipping through the chat. I'm trying to make sure I've addressed some stuff. Feel free to, Chris, if you notice I completely skipped over something, please feel free to call me out on it. Some job posts do ask for sample course syllabi, and that is often a very common artifact in the teaching dossier, because the course syllabi often will be an opportunity to capture some of your teaching values and practices. So that is a very common document to appear in appendices. Kimber asked a question about teaching evaluations are available upon request. I feel like every time I see the words available upon request, it has to do with references. I'm very curious to get Chris's thoughts on this one about teaching evaluations available upon request. The only reason I'm hesitating a little bit is that teaching evaluations also requires interpretation and a little bit of explanation of context in order for it to be more valuable than not. And so, for example, at CTSI, we have guidance around like how do you read course evals at the University of Toronto.
I was just typing a response to Kimber's point, and I think, Kimber, you were saying if you have limited pages but really strong course evals and you want to talk about them, I mean, one way could be summarizing the course evaluation data, especially the quantitative data in a very short table. Maybe you even just do 3 of the 6 items is one way, and then select qualitative feedback to do. Again, it's challenging because how will they know if that's representative broadly, but if there's not space to do that. Also, in the narrative pieces of a statement, you can draw on the course evaluations. That could be your evidence of teaching effectiveness. Value is X, practice is Y, impact is in my course evals. Here's the qualitative feedback I heard from students, direct quote. Here's how I'm scoring on these pieces. So that could be another way that you could bring it in if there's not the space for that. Again, this is also for folks thinking about, someone had asked, if this is likely, if these are research focused roles, maybe they're going to ask for less, and that's definitely true. So for folks who end up in teaching focused positions, whether you get your first job or you're going up for your tenure and review, the expectation is that you're going to need a lot of this. So it really depends on how you're thinking about your own career trajectory as well.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's really helpful. Lynn asked a question about the course syllabi. Are these supposed to be syllabi that you have developed? What if you have not designed your own course before? Is it expected that you develop a hypothetical course syllabus, or are they asking for syllabi of course you have taught before, but not necessarily designed? So first and foremost, I think it's important to, it depends on what the job posting is asking for, and sometimes asking for that clarification. Now, teaching dossiers are both a record of what you have done, but they're also representative of aspirational pieces. So let's say you have not taught a course, or you've only taught a particular type of course, but you really wanted to teach, say, a fourth year seminar. So maybe you have developed a syllabi of here is how I would teach a fourth year seminar about these topics. Here's how I would use a flipped classroom, things like that. So these hypothetical syllabi are, again, an opportunity for you to highlight your teaching values, your future teaching practices. And then this is when we talked about impact, is what you anticipate some of these practices to do for your learners. Yes, and Kimber shared seeing job posting asking for hypothetical syllabi when they specifically want you to develop new courses. Now, for some, maybe you've taught a course where the syllabi was handed to you, but you've made modifications. So this is where it's important in your appendices and your narrative introduction to clearly state, like, on page 4 of the syllabi, I, changed the assessment activities because of X, Y, and Z, right? So really, again, helping your readers figure out, what do you want me to pay attention to or remember from your teaching dossiers? Because these are long documents. So we are going to go on a whirlwind trip through these various components, we spent the most time on statement teaching philosophy because as evidence from the chat, that is the one document that will appear in many job postings. Now, if you do have the opportunity to develop a full dossier, you may want to think about how your teaching experiences are actually quite diverse and varied. And so on the slide, we've included a word cloud with words that may help you think about maybe there are certain things you've done that you didn't think that was part of your teaching experience, but could actually fit quite well. This could include a lot of that mentorship opportunities, your guest lecturing, workshop facilitation, or even assessment design. Maybe a colleague consulted with you to work together collaboratively to develop a particular type of case studies, etc. So really thinking about there are many forms of teaching that is beyond the classroom, and how can you talk about them and really highlight your role and how your values shape all of these experiences. So your teaching experiences at the end of the day is actually much more than the course list. It describes your various roles and responsibilities as well as your context, which we emphasized earlier. And then it also highlights the scope. For example, teaching a 200-person undergraduate lecture is very different from supervising 3 graduate trainers in the lab, trainees in the lab. Not that one is better than the other, but the way you're going to talk about it will be different. And then also connecting experiences to your teaching priorities, really thinking about your teaching values again, of how, for example, with mentorship and supervision, maybe you actually meet with your supervisees at least twice a month, right? And that may be an opportunity for you to connect back to your values of community. Teaching experiences are often presented as a summary table, and again, accompanied by a brief narrative context. So that's section 2 of a typical teaching dossier. Section 3, this is where you get to have lots of fun talking about your teaching practices and strategies. So here you're moving beyond listing your roles, but you're actually describing your approaches in much more detail. You can be talking about things like, well, how do you structure research training or lab sessions? How do you structure discussions or inquiry? How do you build that community and relationship with your supervisees or mentees? And then you might also want to talk about how you develop instructional materials, such as lab manuals, such as rubrics, things like that. So maybe even slide decks, case studies is a big one that I've seen a lot recently, or contributing to program and curriculum design. What's another example? Onboarding materials is another great one for research trainees, right? So again, you're going to notice as you're drafting these sections, you might say like, well, I've already talked about this in my statement of teaching philosophy. Yes, this is actually the area where you get to expand a lot more and signal different things that are evolving and happening. So again, just re-emphasizing that your teaching practices do need to connect back to your values, and they also segue into section 4 of your dossier, which is your evidence of teaching effectiveness. So earlier I mentioned that it's important for us to think about our different sources of evidence. On the slide, we've offered some forms where evidence can appear. So formal end of course evals is certainly one, but then many folks also engage with informal mid-course feedback. Maybe you do start, stop, continue, change in your class, or you have 1-minute reflections for students to do. So other forms of written learner feedback is also important, such as emails. I often jokingly say to instructors, like, create a smile file. When students say like, thank you so much for supporting me this year through our mentorship program. I really appreciate that you did X, Y, and Z. Save those emails, because usually what happens is when you're trying to draft your teaching dossier, it's really hard to locate those documents again. Maybe you had a peer, a colleague that observed you in one of your teaching contexts, and they've written down some of the things that they've noticed. That could also work as a form of evidence. If you've engaged with teaching awards or you've been nominated, I think that's great. That signals recognition and that can be included. And then for those mentoring in labs or clinical environments, mentorship and supervision evidence is especially relevant. So that could be your trainee feedback, their documented progress, or maybe they did conference presentations. Because of your mentorship, it resulted in a publication or skills development or a successful completion of a project. All those are different forms of evidence. And they're basically what we call learning evidence, right? So learning evidence can also be how students do in particular assess work, how students' own reflection that they've shared with you demonstrate growth throughout the semester, throughout the year. And then instructional artifacts such as assignments, rubrics, lesson plans, or structured activities can also serve as evidence, as long as you accompany with a brief explanation of how they're reflecting on your teaching values and your practices. Stephanie shared, are we allowed to just share students' email? I assume you block out their names and should you still get permission? Great question. Please get permission. It is a good idea to get permission. And even when getting permission, the general practice is to not include any of their personal details. Some folks have asked about how things talked about in the email still may be identifiable to a particular person. So this is where having a conversation with the person who emailed saying, could I use this for my teaching dossier? It's helpful. I want to share a common scenario that's come up in many of our conversations at CTSI, and I would love to get some of your ideas in the chat. So here we have a scenario where you've been mentoring undergraduate and graduate students in your lab. There are no formal evaluation systems in place, so no course evals, like anything like that. But occasionally mentees do email to thank you for your guidance. And recently you've noticed a job posting requesting evidence of teaching effectiveness. So I'm curious from you folks, how could you solicit feedback on mentorship? And I feel like we've actually talked about this already. And what forms of evidence could you include in your dossier for this job posting? Just popping into the chat. I'm smiling at Kate's comment. If we are the ones assessing them in the assessment, actually acceptable evidence of teaching effectiveness, I mentored Jane, she got an A+. I think this is where showing growth would be particularly helpful. Perhaps Jane was struggling with methodology earlier in the semester, but by the end of the term, Jane achieved an A+ and showed very strong performance across the board. I think that might be more effective at showing sort of the impact of your mentorship. So folks, if you are mentoring folks in labs, how do you get those evals? Mohammed shares some strategies, anonymous surveys, short testimonial or letter, maybe emails from them. And one way to enhance the emails, if let's say a student emails you, and let's say I email Chris, my mentor in the lab, and I say, Chris, loved your lab. Have a great summer. Chris can always email me back and say, thank you so much. What are the particular things that I've done that like really fostered your sense of belonging in the lab, right? So asking that follow-up, asking students to provide specific examples, that's also very helpful. I think other ideas could include documentation of training outcomes if, let's say, your lab is working towards certain project milestones, asking students, lab trainees to share their reflection, and also peer observation from colleagues, from other folks who are in the same lab space as you is especially helpful. Stephanie shares something like, can you tell me what specifically helped you feel included or learn in this lab? Exactly. So being very specific in how you're asking for these feedback can be helpful. So here the key thing is sometimes you do need to solicit feedback. And even sharing with students, like, this is part of my teaching and learning journey. Like, this is how I improve my practice. Can you share things that supported you? And what are some things that you were hoping for, or things that you hope to be done for future trainees? If there's a standard survey form, that would be great though. One standard way of asking for feedback is the start, stop, continue, change format, where asking students is, to identify, like, what are the things you want me to start doing, stop doing, continue doing, and change, and asking them again for very specific examples. Cindy, when I have a chance, I can see if I have a screenshot of one of the Padlets I set up that has those prompts. Also, if you Google start, stop, continue, change, I think lots of people have written about this. And then for things that are more specific to your discipline, specific to labs, asking colleagues, maybe some of your other colleagues have developed these, right? So this way you can start also borrowing some of their ideas and incorporating them. Can I ask my supervisor for a kind of testimony letter, not sure what it's called, to prove my ability to supervise students during my postdoc fellowship? So this is from Dina. That is a great question. I can only speak to the humanities side, where yes, this is something that does happen. And sometimes I do invite supervisors to come in and watch, what I'm doing, or I show them, like, here are some of the artifacts I've created to help with student onboarding, orientation, and the supervisor can write letters. I'm just curious from those in the chat as well. Have you heard of this practice? It has happened, right, Chris? Yeah, you're nodding. Oh, thank you, Cindy, for sharing the links. And Akari shared, any tips on providing evidence from TA experience if it was several years ago and you have limited materials from that time? We do have a TA expert in the room, Chris.
I feel like this is a hard one. It's not even really about TA experience per se, but I would just say, you can take a brief moment to lament the things you did not collect or document, and just going forward, make a point to do that work of documentation. Because I had a similar experience once I started putting my dossier together. I had years that I was just like, oh, I can't really account for what I have. I mean, the best you can do is go back and see what you have available still to you. And sometimes you may have more than you think once you actually start doing the work of organizing. Like, do I have syllabi? Do I have activities that I have done? Do I have any lingering emails from students in my inbox? But I would just say take it as an opportunity to be diligent in collecting things in the future. And once you start doing that work, you have your categories, collecting student feedback, assignments I've designed, my own observations and reflections, and hopefully that should make that easier.
Yeah. And Chris, your last point, like your own observation reflections, that's really the starting point of a teaching journal. And
Yeah.
some folks do that. They, at the end of every semester, they'll write something down in the Microsoft Word document or Google Doc, and they just sort of preserve that over time. And that's really helpful in showing kind of that growth, your trajectory as an educator. Speaking of trajectory, let's move on to professional. Oh, oops, nope, I forgot about this slide. Interpreting and contextualizing evidence. We can't just have evidence, we need to interpret and contextualize. So here, it's just a reminder that evidence shouldn't stand alone. So again, you want to remind your readers of your context and help them notice certain patterns and explain what these evidence and artifacts are demonstrating, right? Like, the emails and testimonials and the evaluations really, really well, but your reader is just being introduced to this. Now, acknowledge that there are certain limitations when appropriate. For example, like, let's say you are a guest lecturer and you just hopped in for 1 hour. So there's certain limitations around that. So I think it's important to explain that when you're presenting your evidence, and then always connecting it back to your values and practices, right? So really that is our takeaway for this session. We didn't play a drinking game. For every time if one of us says values, then we do take a sip of coffee, right? But this is really the takeaway point that we're trying to drive at here. In the fifth section of your teaching dossier, you are talking about your pedagogical professional development. And again, not a list, but really highlighting what did you learn at these professional development opportunities? How has your teaching changed, for good or for bad? and what are some future directions that you want to take. So again, it's about being very intentional with your PD. You are all very busy folks. So you want to think about what am I engaging with and why? And then how do you add that intentionality and reflection piece in how you're talking about the PD? And how do you identify what would you like to try next? So I think on the slide we wrote professional development should demonstrate learning, intentional refinement, and future direction. Can we also use other experiences like presentations to broad audience? Learners were people in their workplace, not undergrad, but still I was teaching them to do something. So this is shared by Stephanie. Absolutely, this is a form of teaching, and it's a wonderful form of teaching if it also aligns with your teaching values, right? Let's say it's all about critical thinking, but critical thinking in different aspects within the discipline. Last but not least, appendices. Again, this is the longest section in your dossier. It is so far away from your statement of teaching philosophy that it's absolutely critical that when you include artifacts in your appendices, that you start with a narrative and you remind people, why am I including this sample assignment? What do I want to what do I want you to notice when you review this rubric? If there's a syllabi or lab guide, what are your contributions, right? Other observation summaries, anonymized learner feedback. I think one thing to balance in when you're thinking about the appendices alongside your evidence of teaching effectiveness is when you are including things, you want to be mindful that you're not cherry picking. For example, you're not going through your course eval and only including comments that are like, Sam was great, Sam is so intelligent, blah, blah, blah. But you're actually highlighting where are there moments where maybe a student's comment helped you think about something, helped you reflect or take a pause and think more intentionally about your teaching practice. So the appendices is a collection of artifacts that, yes, support your values, support your teaching practices, and support your claim about your impact, but it also signals that growth, that trajectory piece, that aspirational piece of who you want to be as an educator. So in the last 4 minutes, I wanted to just highlight a couple of very practical things about your dossier if you are organizing such a large document. Use section headings. Help your readers help you. Help them navigate your document, right? So have a table of contents, include page numbers, write in a way that really helps your readers remember who you are as an educator. What are your values? What are your practices? What are your impact? Usually dossiers are compiled as a single PDF. They do often now include links to certain elements that can't be included in dossier. For example, maybe you created instructional videos. That's not something you can shove into a PDF, but a link is viable. And then think about writing in a way that is skimmable and searchable so that when I hear the word UDL, I immediately think of this person because they've talked about it so often and have aligned everything in their dossier to those core values. So this graphic again with the chain links, values, practices, impact, this must be in your brain now, I hope. VPI, VPI, VPI. As you're reviewing your own dossier, ask yourself, do I know what my values are? Are they articulated? How do my practices align? Are there any evidence that support my claim about my impact? Have I provided enough context so the readers know like what context I'm working in? And does my dossier show my growth and future trajectory as an educator? So in the worksheet, in the very last section of the worksheet, we invite you to think about what will you do in the next 3 months, 6 months, a year. Maybe a first step is going through your email and like, oh my God, I know somebody emailed me and said that was great. Let me find those emails. Or finding those past syllabi. As someone who still doesn't back up her files, right? Like you got to go through those files and find the things that you could potentially use in your statement of teaching philosophy, as well as in your teaching dossier. On our very last slide, we've included various resources. So Christina and I actually collaborated together along with many colleagues across 5 universities on an open access resource called Developing Your Teaching Dossier. Funny how the title of today's session was also called Developing Your Teaching Dossier. So intentional. But there are various modules to help you think about your statement teaching philosophies and even thinking about future direction as you're growing as an educator and preparing for various jobs. There's also the very helpful TATP guide, Preparing to Teaching Dossier Guidelines, as well as CTSI's guide on teaching dossiers, which are currently being updated. However, if you do have additional questions, our email is available on the slides, ctsi.teaching@utoronto.ca. We look forward to connecting with you and wishing you every success in your job searches. So that's it from Chris and me, handing it back to Amanda.
I love that you ended on perfect timing, 2:59. We're ready to go. So very efficient. Thank you both for such an educational workshop. I loved that you really reinforced the most important messages so that if people only take one thing away, they know exactly what it should be. And I hope that everybody found it useful. So thank you to both of our speakers and thank you to everybody who attended. Have a great day.